In the heart of Kemerovo, a coal mining city tucked into the icy stretches of southwestern Siberia, Vera Pekhteleva was known as a light in the lives of many. The 23-year-old student carried a quiet resilience and unwavering kindness that made her a rare soul, someone who could disarm the bitter cold of her surroundings not just with her warm smile, but with a mind equally sharp and compassionate. She had enrolled at Kuzba State Technical University with a bold ambition to become a specialist in economic security, a field often dominated by men in Russia, particularly because of its ties to government regulation, finance, and anti-corruption efforts. Vera believed that justice wasn't an abstract concept, it was a goal to be pursued actively, methodically, and with empathy. She wanted to make a difference, to fight the very systems that allowed corruption to flourish. Born into a modest family, Vera was raised with strong values, surrounded by people who nurtured her intellect and dreams. She wasn't just academically inclined, she had an artistic streak that expressed itself in her love of music and literature. Teachers admired her discipline. Classmates leaned on her calm wisdom. Her mother, Natalia, often said that Vera was the kind of person who looked for the good in others, even when it hurt her. This unwavering belief in people was what made her fall for Vladislav Kanyus. She had known Vladislav since high school. At first, their connection seemed innocent, like the kind of youthful infatuation that flares up and fizzles out with time. But Vladislav was different. He was charming in a disarming, unpredictable way. He could be tender one moment, aggressive the next. Vera's friends picked up on this quickly, but she, ever the optimist, refused to believe that his anger was anything more than emotional immaturity. After all, she reasoned, people who have been hurt themselves often lash out. Maybe with enough care, attention, and patience, he would change. They officially began dating in 2016, when both were in university. Initially, Vladislav appeared to be invested in their relationship. He brought her flowers, surprised her with notes, made plans for a future together. But the cracks started to show early on. He had a short temper. He was possessive. He would question her male classmates, accuse her of flirting, scroll through her phone messages without her permission. At first, he apologized after each episode. "I just love you too much," he'd say. Or, "I get scared of losing you." To someone like Vera, who was so eager to understand and forgive, these explanations struck chords of empathy rather than fear. But the truth was, Vladislav was a deeply disturbed young man. Behind his apologies and moments of affection was a violent streak that only grew more pronounced with time. As the months passed, he became increasingly aggressive. He tried to control what she wore, who she saw, and where she went. If she pushed back, he would turn cold, distant, or erupt in rage. Vera's world, once filled with promise and independence, began to narrow around the whims of a man who was emotionally volatile and psychologically abusive. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor. Once bubbly and enthusiastic, Vera became more withdrawn. She canceled outings, avoided long conversations, and always seemed to be somewhere else mentally. On more than one occasion, she came to class with bruises she couldn't quite explain. She would laugh it off, say she fell, bumped into something, or just didn't sleep well. Her close friends tried to confront her gently, but she always defended Vladislav. "He's just under stress," she'd say. "He's not always like this." Her mother and aunt grew concerned as well. They had heard stories, neighbors talking about raised voices, slammed doors, nights when Vera's cries echoed down the hallway of the apartment she shared with Vladislav. They tried to intervene, urged her to come home, to leave him. But Vera resisted. Part of it was fear, perhaps. But part of it, tragically, was hope that maybe if she could just hold on a little longer, things would get better. But things never got better. By late 2019, Vera had reached her limit. Vladislav had grown even more unpredictable and controlling. There were nights she feared for her life. Though she hadn't spoken openly about it to many, she began making quiet steps to reclaim her independence. In November, she took a decisive leap. She left the apartment and moved into a university dormitory. It wasn't just a change in address. It was an act of courage, a declaration that she was ready to break free from the cycle of abuse. However, Vera's escape wasn't entirely clean. She left in a hurry, and many of her belongings, including important academic documents, clothes, and personal items, remained at the apartment she had once shared with Vladislav. She told her friends she planned to return soon to collect the rest. She didn't want to see him, but she believed that if she was careful, if she timed it right, she could avoid conflict. On the morning of January 14th, 2020, Vera made that final journey back to the apartment. No one knows exactly what she expected that day. Perhaps she thought Vladislav wouldn't be there. Perhaps she thought he would let her go quietly. But Vladislav was there, and his rage had been festering for weeks. What followed was a scene of unimaginable horror. As neighbors would later testify, screaming began almost as soon as Vera entered the building. It continued for hours, chilling, terrified cries that pierced through walls and ceilings. She begged for mercy. She pleaded for help. But behind the locked door of the apartment, Vladislav unleashed a level of violence that was both intimate and monstrous. For over 3 hours, he tortured her. He beat her with his fists, with blunt objects, slammed her into walls, choked her, and ultimately strangled her to death using an iron cord from an electric kettle. By the time neighbors broke down the door, after making multiple calls to the police, all of which went unanswered, it was too late. Vera's lifeless body lay on the floor. Her face and limbs were swollen with bruises. She had 56 separate injuries, including severe brain trauma and signs of prolonged suffering. The horror of what happened to Vera didn't end with her death. It extended into the silence of the authorities who had ignored the cries for help. It extended into a justice system that had failed to recognize the warning signs of escalating abuse. And it extended into a culture where women like Vera are often told to endure, to forgive, to understand, even when their lives are at risk. Vera Pekhteleva was not just a name in a news headline. She was a daughter, a student, a friend. She had dreams and ambitions. She wanted to make Russia a better place. She believed in change, even in those least deserving of her faith. That belief cost her everything. Her story continues to haunt a nation that has yet to fully reckon with its epidemic of domestic violence. But through remembrance, through the voices that refuse to let her death be in vain, Vera lives on, not as a victim, but as a symbol of what must change. January 14th, 2020, began like any other winter day in Kemerovo. Snow blanketed the city in silence, muffling the hum of traffic and the routines of ordinary life. But for the residents of a modest apartment building on Leningradsky Avenue, the day would unravel into something chilling, something unforgettable. As the afternoon slipped into evening and the icy wind swept against aging windows, none of the building's residents could have foreseen that their homes would soon become unwilling witnesses to an unrelenting act of cruelty. At approximately 5 p.m., the peace of the evening was shattered. It started as a faint argument, muffled voices through the walls. But within minutes, the tone escalated into unmistakable distress. From behind the closed door of apartment number 66, screams rang out, piercing, raw, and filled with terror. It was Vera Pekhteleva. Her cries for help tore through the building, sending immediate waves of dread through the neighbors living on the same floor and beyond. Vera was not a stranger to those neighbors. Many had seen her coming and going over the past few years, an intelligent, polite young woman, often quiet, occasionally with a strained look that lingered longer than it should have. Some had heard arguments before. Some had even seen bruises. But no one imagined that this night would be her last. And no one could have expected just how long her suffering would last before anyone reached her. By 5:20 p.m., the sounds had intensified. Loud crashes, yelling, and continued screaming flooded the stairwells. Neighbors, gripped by panic, picked up their phones and began calling emergency services. One woman, living directly next door, told operators she feared a young woman was being murdered. "She's screaming like she's being tortured," she reportedly said. "Please send someone. Please hurry." That was the first of what would become a series of calls. each more desperate than the last. The Russian emergency number 112 received at least 7 separate calls from different residents in the building over the course of the next 2.5 hours. Each caller described the same horrific scene: a woman being beaten, cries for help, sounds of objects breaking, thuds against walls. And yet, no officers arrived. Time ticked forward with a cruel slowness. Every minute stretched unbearably for the residents listening helplessly as Vera's voice grew hoarse, then weaker, then finally faded to silence. In one apartment, an elderly couple stood by their door, shaking with fear. They didn't dare to intervene directly. What if the man inside had a weapon? What if he turned on them? But they kept calling, kept hoping someone in uniform would show up. But the door downstairs remained closed. No one came. Inside the apartment, Vladislav Kanyus was committing a prolonged and calculated assault on Vera. His rage knew no bounds. He beat her with his fists and used nearby objects as weapons. Anything within reach became an instrument of pain. Witnesses would later report hearing loud banging sounds, like furniture or heavy appliances being moved or thrown. Vera screamed for over 3 hours. She cried for help, for mercy. She tried to escape, but Vladislav blocked her path at every turn. He slammed her against the walls. He reportedly punched her so hard in the face and head that she suffered multiple concussions and traumatic brain injuries. Her attempts to reason with him, if she made them, fell on deaf ears. Vladislav was not in a state of mind that allowed for reason. Whether he was enraged by her attempt to leave him permanently or consumed by a twisted sense of control, what he unleashed on her was not just violence, it was torture. And still, no help came. After 2 hours of unrelenting noise and chaos, a group of neighbors could take no more. Terrified but galvanized by the inaction of the police, they gathered in the hallway outside the apartment and tried to break down the door themselves. They kicked. They shoved. They yelled. But the heavy door would not budge. Vladislav had locked it securely from the inside. It was almost as if he knew that no one would come in time, knew that he could take his time. Some neighbors ran to borrow tools, anything that could break the lock. A man from the floor below returned minutes later with a sledgehammer. It was a desperate move, an act of courage fueled by helplessness. With each swing of the hammer, the thick wooden door splintered, inch by inch. The hallway filled with the dull thud of metal against wood, over and over again. Some stood back, hands over their mouths in shock. Others joined in, trying to pry open the frame. Inside, Vera had already been mortally wounded. When the door finally gave way just before 8:30 p.m., a heavy silence hung in the air. The apartment was in disarray, furniture overturned, broken glass scattered across the floor. In the center of the living room lay Vera's body, crumpled and lifeless. Bloodstains marked the walls and floor. Her face was barely recognizable. Her body bore the devastating evidence of everything she had endured: cuts, deep bruises, abrasions, and visible signs of strangulation. Later, the coroner's report would confirm what the neighbors already feared. Vera had suffered 56 separate injuries, including traumatic brain damage, fractured ribs, a broken nose, and multiple internal injuries. The final act that ended her life was strangulation by an electric iron cord, wrapped so tightly around her neck that it left deep imprints. There were indications that the violence had escalated methodically, starting with punches, progressing to beatings with objects, and ending in a slow, deliberate strangulation. Vladislav, as neighbors would later describe, appeared almost calm. He did not flee. He did not resist. When confronted, he made no effort to explain. It was as if he had accepted the outcome long before anyone entered the apartment. The horror that filled that home would soon spill into the larger Russian consciousness. As details emerged, particularly the fact that so many emergency calls went ignored, the public reacted with fury. The neighbors had done everything right. They had called. They had reported the violence. Some had risked their own safety to try to stop it. And yet, their efforts were thwarted not by apathy, but by a systemic failure in the very institutions meant to protect people like Vera. Why didn't the police come? That question would hang over the investigation like a black cloud. In the days and weeks that followed, local authorities would scramble to offer explanations. Some claimed the calls were improperly routed. Others said officers were delayed due to staff shortages. But none of it could explain how 3 full hours of active, reported violence could go unaddressed in a major Russian city. None of it could explain how a woman's life could be stolen, slowly, agonizingly, while help was just blocks away. In interviews, residents of the building spoke out with sorrow and rage. Many were traumatized by what they had heard that night. Some blamed themselves for not breaking the door sooner. Others blamed the system outright. One neighbor, a woman who lived directly beneath the apartment, said she couldn't sleep for weeks after the incident. "I heard her," she whispered. "I heard her asking for help. And no one came." The emotional toll on the community was devastating. Not only had they lost Vera, a young woman full of promise, they had witnessed her final moments through the walls, powerless to intervene in time. Their grief was magnified by guilt, even though they had done more than most would have dared. They had tried to be the help Vera needed. But the people who were trained, who were sworn to serve and protect, they never arrived. In the aftermath, candlelight vigils were held. Flowers were laid outside the building. Strangers who never knew Vera mourned her loss. Protests were organized in Kemerovo and other cities across Russia. The phrase, "we heard her scream," became a rallying cry on social media, a grim reminder of what happens when domestic violence is treated as a private matter rather than a national emergency. For Vera Pekhteleva, the night of January 14, 2020, was meant to be simple. She had returned to collect her belongings, to close a chapter. But instead, she was met with the full force of a man's unchecked rage and a system's indifference. Her final hours were filled with agony. But they were also surrounded by the faint sounds of her community trying to help, knocking, calling, shouting, hammering. And yet, those efforts were not enough. Because the system meant to back them up, the system meant to save her, never came. In the days that followed Vera Pekteleva's murder, the city of Kemerovo was blanketed not only in snow but in a growing sense of shame and collective grief. People were mourning Vera, her life, her brutal death, her unrealized future, but more than anything, they were mourning the terrifying realization that her death had been preventable. She had not died in secret. She had not suffered in isolation. Her screams had been heard by neighbors, reported in real time to the authorities, and yet help never came. For the people of Kemerovo, and eventually for all of Russia, the question that began to burn was not only, how could this happen, but how could this happen again and no one be held accountable? The failure of the police to respond to multiple emergency calls was not a mere oversight. It was the manifestation of something deeper, a structural rot in the system meant to protect victims of domestic abuse. The sheer horror of what had transpired in Vera's final hours left no room for excuses. This wasn't a matter of slow response times or bureaucratic confusion. 7 distinct calls had been placed to emergency services. 7 different moments where someone with power and responsibility could have made a choice to act. And each time they failed. In the wake of public outrage, authorities tried to contain the damage. The Kemerovo Police Department issued a curt statement acknowledging that officers had received multiple calls but failed to dispatch a unit to the scene. There was no apology, no real explanation, just a statement of fact, a bland acknowledgement of what had now become a national scandal. Within a few weeks, 2 officers were identified and charged with criminal negligence. Their names were withheld at first, but the media quickly uncovered their identities. Both were mid-ranking officers who had been on duty the night of January 14th. The official record revealed that the calls about Vera's cries for help had come through their emergency dispatch line, but neither officer sent out a patrol unit. Worse, they did not even record the calls properly in their logs. It was almost as if Vera's life, and the screams that echoed through those phone lines, had never mattered at all. But even as these charges were filed, it became clear that justice, in the legal sense, was not what most people had hoped for. The officers were charged under Article 293 of the Russian Criminal Code, which covers negligence, but specifically under a provision used for cases that result in harm due to carelessness, rather than malicious intent. This was not the equivalent of gross misconduct or willful dereliction of duty. It was, essentially, the lightest possible interpretation of their failure. If convicted, each officer faced a maximum sentence of 5 years, but more likely, they would receive suspended sentences or fines. The fury from the public only grew. To those watching closely, it was a familiar story. Russia, they said, had never taken domestic violence seriously. Vera's death was horrifying, yes, but not surprising. It was a symptom of a wider disease. In 2017, 3 years before Vera's murder, the Russian government had passed legislation that would later be seen as a death sentence for many women trapped in violent homes. That year, under pressure from conservative lawmakers and the Russian Orthodox Church, President Vladimir Putin signed into law a bill that decriminalized first-time domestic violence offenses, provided the victim did not suffer serious injury. The language of the law was chilling in its simplicity. If a husband, parent, or sibling beat a woman or child, but did not break bones or cause long-term disability, it was no longer a criminal offense. Instead, it was categorized as an administrative violation, akin to a traffic ticket. The maximum penalty? A fine of up to 30,000 rubles, approximately $400, community service, or a brief period of detention, usually no more than 15 days. Critics of the law warned that this was not just a legislative change. It was a cultural signal, a green light to abusers, a message that what happened behind closed doors was no longer the state's concern. Women's rights activists, lawyers, and survivors of abuse raised the alarm. They staged protests, wrote open letters, and begged for reconsideration. But the law passed easily through the Duma, with little opposition. Supporters of the bill, many of whom were high-profile politicians, claimed that criminalizing family discipline was an intrusion into private life. One lawmaker infamously stated that a slap does not warrant jail. Another said that keeping families together should be prioritized over the Western obsession with criminal justice. The consequences were immediate and devastating. In the years that followed, reports of domestic abuse spiked, but prosecutions dropped sharply. Women who sought help were routinely dismissed. Police officers, emboldened by the legal downgrade, often refused to even log complaints. If there was no visible bruising, or if the injuries were not considered grave, victims were turned away, told to work it out at home or stop provoking him. Many women stopped calling altogether, having learned through bitter experience that doing so is futile. Vera Pekhteleva was one of those women caught in this dangerous legal limbo. Her ex-boyfriend, Vladislav Kanyus, had a documented history of violence and controlling behavior. According to friends and family, Vera had expressed fear in the weeks leading up to her murder. But she had not reported him to the police. Why would she? She had no broken bones, no long-term injuries, and most importantly, she had no faith that they would do anything. When Vera went to collect her belongings from Vladislav's apartment on that cold January evening, she likely believed she would be safe. She had left him weeks before. She was moving on. And even if something did go wrong, surely someone would help. She had neighbors, phones, a legal system designed to protect people like her. Or so she thought. The truth is, Vera was walking into a trap. And when she screamed, when her cries echoed down the hallway and into the phones of the police station, the system chose not to listen. Vera's murder became a symbol in Russia, not just of male violence, but of state indifference. Her face was plastered across protest signs. Her name was spoken in public hearings. Online, women across the country began sharing their own stories of abuse, harassment, and abandonment by law enforcement. Hashtags like #JusticeForVera and #WeHeardHer trended for weeks. One particularly powerful protest came from a group of women in Moscow who stood outside the Ministry of Internal Affairs, each holding a printed transcript of one of the 112 calls made by Vera's neighbors. In the freezing cold, they stood silently, the transcript shaking in their hands, while police officers stood just meters away, officers who, it seemed, were better at policing dissent than protecting life. Journalists began digging into similar cases where women had died after their pleas for help were ignored. They found dozens, then hundreds. One woman in St. Petersburg had called the police 9 times before her husband finally beat her to death in front of their children. Another woman in Kazan had sent videos of her abuse to authorities before she was found strangled in a forest. In each case, the pattern was the same: warning signs, ignored reports, empty promises, and eventually, silence. The Russian government, facing mounting pressure, did what authoritarian regimes often do when faced with grassroots outrage. They cracked down. Some protests were forcibly dispersed. Some activists were detained. State television tried to reframe the narrative, emphasizing that not all police officers are bad or that individual mistakes should not be blamed on the system. But it was too late. Vera's story had broken something open. A quiet revolution was underway, not just in policy debates, but in the hearts and minds of Russian citizens, especially women. They no longer believed the system would protect them. And many no longer believed that reform was even possible within the current framework. Still, some hope remained. Legal advocates used the publicity of Vera's case to reignite calls for reversing the 2017 decriminalization law. A coalition of lawyers and activists drafted new legislative proposals, demanding that domestic violence once again be treated as a criminal matter, regardless of injury severity. They argued for the creation of specialized domestic violence units within the police. They called for better training, for shelters, for counseling services, for full-scale national strategy. But the resistance was fierce. Conservative politicians blocked most proposals. State media ignored them. And the public, though still outraged, began to lose momentum as the months dragged on and the court case stalled. When the trial of the 2 negligent officers finally began, expectations were low. The prosecution made a modest case. The officers had violated procedure by failing to respond to the emergency calls. The defense argued that the officers were overworked, underpaid, and had made an honest mistake. In the end, the court agreed partially with both sides. One officer received a suspended sentence. The other was fined. Neither lost their job permanently. Neither went to jail. For Vera's family, it was a second tragedy. They had lost their daughter. Now they had lost any sense of justice. Her mother, in a heart-wrenching statement outside the courthouse, said simply, "They heard her. They all heard her. And they let her die." In the aftermath, her family continued to fight. They founded a small foundation in Vera's name, aimed at providing legal support for victims of domestic violence. They gave interviews. They told her story over and over again, not because it was easy, but because they hoped it might save someone else. And slowly, despite all the obstacles, the story of Vera Pekhteleva began to reshape the national conversation. She had not died in vain. Her screams had not gone unheard. They had sparked something larger than one tragedy. They had laid bare a truth too long hidden in silence. The wheels of justice in Vera Pekteleva's case turned slowly and, as many feared, with little regard for the magnitude of her suffering. Following her brutal murder on January 14, 2020, her killer, Vladislav Kanyus, was arrested, charged, and placed in pre-trial detention. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Not only had he been found in the apartment with Vera's lifeless body, but forensic examinations matched his DNA to multiple injuries on her body. The crime scene was horrific: a broken iron cord used as a garrote, pools of blood, signs of an extended, violent struggle. Yet despite the scale and savagery of what he had done, the legal process that followed was curiously muted, almost surgical in its detachment from the emotional devastation at the heart of the case. From the outset, there were troubling indications that the system might not handle Vera's case with the gravity it deserved. Vladislav was charged under Article 105 of the Russian Criminal Code, murder, but not under Article 105(2), aggravated murder, which would have acknowledged the extraordinary cruelty and prolonged torture that defined Vera's final hours. In Russian law, aggravated murder includes elements such as premeditation, particular brutality, or murder committed with sadistic motives. By any moral or rational standard, Vera's murder fit these criteria. The autopsy report listed 56 injuries, including multiple contusions, lacerations, broken ribs, and signs of prolonged strangulation. The medical examiner testified that Vera had likely survived for nearly 3 hours during the assault, regaining consciousness multiple times. She had fought back. She had screamed. She had begged for her life. The level of sustained violence indicated a chilling intent, not only to kill but to terrorize and punish. Still, prosecutors declined to pursue aggravated murder charges. Their rationale, as later disclosed in court documents, hinged on a technical reading of the law. Because there was no clear evidence of sadistic motive, and because the murder occurred during what they termed a domestic conflict, the case was not escalated to its more severe classification. It was a bureaucratic decision, devoid of emotional weight, and yet its implications were enormous. Aggravated murder carries a sentence of up to life imprisonment in Russia. Standard murder charges, by contrast, cap at 15 to 20 years. Vladislav would not face the possibility of life behind bars. For Vera's family, this was a second blow, an institutional betrayal that followed the police inaction that had led to her death. Her mother, Vera Pekhteleva, sat through court hearings clutching her daughter's photo, her knuckles white with silent fury. In interviews, she spoke with a heartbreaking calmness, describing the unimaginable pain of seeing her daughter's killer treated with what seemed like judicial leniency. He didn't just kill her, Elena said in one interview. He tortured her. He made her suffer. And now they want to call it a domestic dispute? Activists and legal experts across Russia echoed the family's outrage. Prominent women's rights groups launched online petitions demanding the charges be upgraded. Hashtags such as #JusticeForVera and #PunishKanyus gained traction. Public demonstrations, though modest due to increasing political repression, sprang up in several cities. Protesters held up signs with stark, uncompromising messages. "This is not a quarrel. This is murder." She screamed for 3 hours. No one came. "Will my death be domestic too?" Despite the pressure, prosecutors held their ground. The case moved forward under the lesser charge. The trial itself was both harrowing and surreal. Vladislav appeared in court stone-faced, occasionally smirking, his hands cuffed in front of him. He offered no apology. He showed no remorse. At one point, he claimed that Vera had provoked him, an assertion that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. He described an argument that got out of hand, a narrative that stood in grotesque contrast to the forensic evidence and eyewitness accounts. It was a classic defense used by abusers worldwide, blaming the victim, diminishing the violence, rewriting the story into something almost mundane. The prosecution presented a compelling timeline. On January 14, 2020, Vera had returned to Vladislav's apartment to collect the remainder of her belongings. They argued briefly, and then Vladislav began to beat her. He hit her with his fists, slammed her against walls, struck her with household objects. As neighbors later testified, her screams were blood-curdling, raw, desperate, persistent. Vladislav did not stop. At some point, he fetched an iron cord, possibly from a clothes iron or heater, and wrapped it around her neck. He tightened it, let go, then tightened it again. The medical examiner noted ligature marks that suggested multiple episodes of strangulation, interspersed with beatings. It was not a quick killing. It was torture. Yet even with this mountain of evidence, the court maintained its original classification. The judge, in the verdict reading, acknowledged the brutality of the crime but emphasized that, under current statutes, the legal definition of aggravated murder had not been sufficiently met. Vladislav Kanyus was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 17 years in a high-security penal colony. It was the maximum sentence possible under the chosen article, but it was far less than what Vera's family and much of the public had hoped for. 17 years. For the torture and killing of a woman who had trusted him, who had once loved him, who had spent her final hours suffering unthinkably. And then, the unimaginable happened. In April 2023, just over 3 years after his sentencing, Vladislav Kanyus was released from prison. The news spread slowly at first, leaked through unofficial channels. Then it was confirmed. He had been freed early to join the Russian military effort in Ukraine, under a wartime program offering convicts clemency in exchange for combat service. The same man who had tortured and murdered Vera Pekhteleva was now being handed a rifle by the state, given a uniform, and sent to the front lines. No longer a prisoner, but a soldier. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Human rights organizations issued scathing statements. Vera's family was blindsided. They had received no formal notice of his release. Her mother learned about it from journalists. In an emotional press conference, Elena spoke again. Her voice cracked with disbelief. "They told us 17 years. They promised he would pay for what he did. Now they've turned him into a hero." The use of prisoners in military operations had become more common in Russia following the escalation of the war in Ukraine. Under a controversial initiative spearheaded by private military contractors and later sanctioned by the Russian Ministry of Defense, inmates convicted of various crimes, including serious violent offenses, were offered reduced sentences or outright pardons if they agreed to serve in the conflict zone for 6 months or more. The Kremlin framed it as a chance at redemption, a way for criminals to earn back their honor. But for victims' families, it was a nightmare. It meant that the justice system could be overridden at any moment, that a killer's sentence could be undone not by legal appeal, but by war. In Vera's case, the optics were especially appalling. A man who had committed one of the most high-profile, brutal domestic murders in recent Russian history was now being valorized as a patriot. Social media filled with images of Vladislav in fatigues, posing with other conscripts, as if his past had been wiped clean. State-affiliated media said little. Independent outlets, operating under increasing pressure and censorship, did what they could to highlight the absurdity and cruelty of the situation. But the message was clear. In today's Russia, a man who strangles his girlfriend to death can find freedom on the battlefield, while his victim remains buried and forgotten by the state. The trauma for Vera's family deepened. Her mother became more withdrawn. Her cousin stopped speaking to reporters. The foundation started in Vera's name suspended operations temporarily, unable to reconcile their mission with the reality that justice was not only absent, it was being actively undone. Still, some refused to let the story die. Lawyers began exploring whether the military deployment could be challenged in court. Human rights groups gathered data on other convicts released under the same program, hoping to build a broader case against the policy. Public petitions resurfaced, demanding legislative change. And among activists, a new slogan emerged: "You cannot kill, serve, and walk free." But hope remained thin. The Russian legal system, already strained and politicized, showed little appetite for revisiting Vera's case. Officials refused to confirm whether Vladislav had been officially pardoned or simply released under a suspended sentence. His current location was classified. Whether he was alive, injured, or dead on the front lines remained unknown. For many, this uncertainty was yet another cruel twist in a story already defined by abandonment and betrayal. And yet, Vera's legacy endures. Every time her story is told, every time her name is spoken in a courtroom or written on a protest sign, she lives again, not as a victim, but as a symbol of the countless women failed by systems that were meant to protect them. Her death, her suffering, and her family's grief have become a rallying cry across Russia and beyond. In the end, the legal proceedings that followed her murder were not just a trial of Vladislav Kanyus. They were a trial of the system itself. A system that minimized violence, that ignored pleas for help, that reduced torture to a domestic dispute, and that ultimately allowed a killer to walk free. And in that trial, justice did not win. The life of Vera Pekhteleva, cut short in such a brutal and senseless manner, has become a poignant reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by victims of domestic violence and the urgent need for comprehensive reform in both legal frameworks and cultural attitudes. Vera's tragic death is not just the loss of a young woman with a promising future, It is a reflection of the deeply rooted societal and institutional failures that continue to allow violence within the home to be minimized, ignored, or even condoned. Her story, marked by hope, idealism, and a desire to change the world, ended in a horrific act of violence that could have, and should have, been prevented. Vera's life and the horrifying circumstances of her murder highlight an inexcusable gap in protection for those at risk of domestic violence. Despite her intelligence, her aspirations to fight corruption, and her courage in attempting to end an abusive relationship, Vera found herself ensnared in a situation where she had little recourse. The failure of law enforcement to respond effectively to the ongoing violence in her apartment, despite multiple calls from concerned neighbors, reflects a systemic disregard for the safety of women. This systemic failure is not confined to just a few individuals in positions of authority. It is part of a broader cultural and legal landscape that has historically downplayed the severity of domestic abuse. For too long, domestic violence has been perceived as a private issue, something that can be overlooked or handled within the confines of a family unit, rather than as a serious criminal act that requires urgent and immediate intervention. Vera's death also shines a harsh light on the cultural attitudes that have enabled abuse to persist, unchallenged and unchecked, within the home. In Russia, as in many other societies, gendered norms have long dictated that women should endure hardships, including abuse, for the sake of family unity. These cultural expectations have been reinforced by the legal framework, which has often failed to provide the necessary support and protection for victims of domestic violence. The 2017 decriminalization of certain domestic violence offenses was a particularly damaging move, signaling to abusers that their actions would not result in significant legal consequences. This policy not only emboldened perpetrators, but also diminished the gravity of domestic violence in the eyes of law enforcement, the judiciary, and society as a whole. It is clear that, had the legal system been more robust and responsive, Vera might still be alive today. The lack of a coherent and comprehensive legal framework to protect women from domestic violence allowed her killer to escape true justice, ultimately receiving a mere 17-year prison sentence, with his release in 2023 sending shockwaves of further trauma to Vera's family and to the broader community. Vera's case, in all its tragedy, serves as an urgent call to action. It highlights the need for a cultural shift, one that recognizes domestic violence as a crime, not a personal issue to be handled privately. There must be a fundamental rethinking of the way society views domestic violence. It is not enough to simply acknowledge its existence. There must be a widespread recognition of its devastating impact on individuals, families, and communities. No longer should women like Vera be expected to stay silent, to endure abuse in order to protect a family unit that is built on violence. Domestic violence must be recognized as the serious crime it is, and those who suffer at the hands of abusers must have access to the necessary resources to escape that violence and rebuild their lives. Equally important is the need for legal reform. The laws that govern domestic violence in Russia are clearly inadequate and fail to provide the necessary protections for victims. The decriminalization of first-time domestic violence offenses must be reversed, and there must be a push for more stringent legislation that treats domestic violence with the seriousness it warrants. It is essential that Russia implement comprehensive domestic violence laws that explicitly define domestic violence as a crime, criminalize all forms of abuse, and create a system for the prosecution and punishment of offenders. This would be a critical first step in ensuring that victims like Vera have access to a legal framework that is equipped to provide them with protection and justice. Furthermore, the legal system must be held accountable for its failure to respond promptly and adequately to instances of abuse, as was tragically the case with Vera. The police officers who ignored neighbors' distress calls and failed to intervene must face not just criminal negligence charges, but also a systemic reevaluation of how law enforcement handles domestic violence cases. Cultural change and legal reform go hand in hand, and the two must be pursued simultaneously in order to achieve meaningful progress. Public awareness campaigns, aimed at shifting attitudes toward domestic violence, are critical. Society must be made aware that violence within the home is a crime that requires immediate action. This involves not only educating the general public, but also training law enforcement officers, legal professionals, and medical personnel on how to recognize the signs of abuse and how to respond appropriately. Shelters, support groups, and counseling services must be more widely available to victims of domestic violence, particularly in rural and underserved areas. For Vera, the fight for justice did not end with her death. Activists, organizations, and her family have continued to push for change, demanding reforms to the legal system and public policies that will protect women and hold perpetrators accountable. Elena Popova and other advocates have tirelessly called for reforms to Russia's domestic violence laws, citing Vera's case as a catalyst for reform. While the legal landscape remains largely unchanged, Vera's case has undeniably raised the profile of domestic violence in Russia and brought the issue to the forefront of national discourse. Despite these efforts, Vera's death and the failure of the legal system to protect her remain a stark reminder of the challenges that remain in achieving justice for victims of domestic violence. Her case, tragic and senseless as it was, has become a rallying cry for activists and women's rights organizations, both in Russia and internationally. It serves as a painful but necessary reminder that the struggle for gender equality, legal justice, and human rights must be ongoing. Vera's story is not just about one young woman lost. It is about the countless others who suffer in silence, unable to find the support, protection, or justice they need. In the wake of Vera's death, we must continue to amplify her voice and the voices of countless others who have been silenced by domestic violence. We must work together to create a future where such tragedies are no longer tolerated, where the law protects victims, and where cultural norms reflect a commitment to the dignity and safety of all individuals, regardless of gender. Vera's death may have been a tragedy, but her story is a call to action, an action that is long overdue. Let us honor her memory not only through grief, but by ensuring that her death is not in vain. By demanding legal and cultural reform, we can create a world where domestic violence is no longer overlooked, where victims like Vera are given the protection and justice they deserve, and where violence in the home is no longer a hidden epidemic, but a crime that society refuses to tolerate. It is time to act. It is time to stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves. It is time to demand justice.